Hello and welcome to Moderate Fantasy Violence, a podcast about pop culture and the world around it. I'm Alistair.
And I'm Nick.
And today, it's a big episode. We are finally discussing WandaVision, now that the entire series has dropped. And after that, we'll be discussing a new post-apocalyptic German sci-fi show on Netflix, Tribes of Europa. However, before all of that, Nick, what have you been up to recently?
Well, I've been finishing something I've been watching for a while and have mentioned on this show before. I've been finishing my comfort viewing double bill of New Girl and Lucifer, in that I ran out of episodes of both those shows in the last week or so. New Girl entirely, because that finished a few years ago, and Lucifer I caught up with the current episodes and now have to wait like everybody else, which is a complete, probably non-event to most of the rest of the world, but somewhat significant to me because I've been, very much leaning on those shows as a kind of double bill of, I don't know, I not entirely banal, pleasant viewing, but sort of comfortable, emotionally engaging, but not harrowing viewing to get me through the last few months of sitting indoors and feeling slightly glum. I don't know. Unfortunately, the world hasn't quite lined up, so I can finish New Girl and Lucifer like about 10 minutes before I skip back out into the sunlight. In a small way that only really affects me, I quite like the fact that they are finishing just as we're seeing some sign of very, very distant light on the horizon. I don't know. So anyway, yeah, they were both quite good. New Girl was a 7-season sitcom and kind of had a lot of the usual problems 7 seasons of sitcom often has, in that by about seasons 5 or 6, you do start to feel you've seen all the permutations of this joke. But they do keep, advancing the setup and having characters settle down and marry off and change their setup very slightly just to keep things a little fresh. And Lucifer, they jumped to Netflix with season 4 after their broadcast network cruelly cancelled them. And the new improved Netflix premium telly, 20 minutes longer and clearly with a much higher budget version of Lucifer, is quite a lot more fantasy self-indulgence than the old network one. Like, they clearly seem a bit less aggressively wed to the procedural stuff, and there's definitely the sense that there was someone from the network on set saying don't do too much of that weird fantasy shit, yeah? Like, you see more of Lucifer transform into his devil form in his first season on Netflix than you did in the 3 previous ones on the Fox channel in the US. And I enjoyed that, obviously, even though the sort of procedural crime stuff is still there to kind of ground it. And plus, again, much like New Girl, now that it's getting at least within reach of the end, there's only like a season and a half left. That is also, moving characters together and setting up its finale. I mean, I don't know when we'll get to see that. I suspect the coronavirus pandemic will probably, hopefully, end before they manage to release 2 more lots of Lucifer episodes. I suspect that'll be with us till at least towards the end of the year. It's a weird feeling for those to be over. Those, in some strange way, kind of were my pandemic, even though the pandemic does continue.
I guess it's appropriate to have Lucifer with you in these dark times.
Yeah, it turns out the devil is not a horrific sadist evil man, but actually a kind of slightly glib, lovable, yet ultimately angsty supernatural boy.
That sounds good. So, does the ending of New Girl pay off, like the premise, or, does it build to a sort of satisfying conclusion, or is it one of those sitcoms that just sort of stops?
No, it's a romantic comedy. It very much hews to its romantic comedy thing. All the will they, won't they's are resolved. Everyone gets what they want. Is this a spoiler? Probably not. There's a wedding. Like all the romantic comedies, it ends in a wedding. Basically, it ended, the last full-length 20-episode season was series 6, and they clearly thought they were going to get cancelled, so it has a sort of somewhat ending. And then it got brought back for an 8-episode coda epilogue season to finish it off completely. So they did a time jump and had lots of, what happens to them in the end stuff. So yeah, they very much got to finish.
At least it sounds satisfying for the audience. It's worth sticking with it for 7 seasons if there's a good ending at the end of it.
Yeah, it's worth sticking to the end of New Girl. I think by about, it's always sort of likeable and fun from quite early on, but by about season 2 or 3, they've definitely got a fairly strong handle on what they're doing. There's a couple of characters who don't really come into focus till about season 3, which is impressive considering they're in every episode from the beginning. So yeah, it's a bit of a long game, but it does at least, the fact that these dynamics keep changing a bit does at least stop it getting boring, which can happen when it's a show about the same 4 or 5 people hanging around the same loft flat set for about 20 hours a year.
And it's interesting what you're saying about how Lucifer changes. I can see why Netflix maybe weren't so keen to do a crime procedural because, we're very well served for crime procedurals on network television. And I guess they're trying to do something different to lure people away. But yeah, it's interesting there's such a stark change. And there's a Netflix model, or you might call it the sort of contemporary model of making television, and Netflix were keen to update Lucifer to meet that model.
Well, yeah, and on a shallow level, now they can say shit, and you can occasionally see the lead actor Tom Ellis's bum.
Those things really make a show. Whenever I'm reviewing something, I was like, does it say shit? Tick. Bums? Tick. All right, we're good to go.
So on that scale, both the shows we're about to review are just complete disasters.
No, that was it. You've ruined the review section, Nick.
I think I've just made future episodes a lot shorter. Anyway, with the procedural crime stuff, the Netflix seasons of Lucifer are much shorter. Like, obviously, it's the usual 10, 12, 16 episode premium telly thing rather than 20. And even the 16 episode 5th season they've commissioned is released in 2, 8 episode mini seasons. Part of the reason there's a lot more of the mythology stuff in any given episode is that there's a lot less space to do all the subplot stuff. The procedural case of the week stuff is a lot more downplayed than it was. I mean, in a way, it's kind of a shame, as Lucifer is, although it does have this sort of silly, melodramatic, oh no, I'm cursed, I must go to hell forever type angle, it's ultimately quite a silly show. Like, a lot of the best bits of Lucifer are when they're just kind of clearly dicking around. When, the writers are obviously aware how stupid it is. The one downside of a slightly shorter season is it does sometimes give them a little less space to just play around. Although I do hear rumours there's going to be a musical episode before this show ends, which I don't know if it's going to be good or bad, but I'm definitely glad it exists.
That sounds interesting, yeah. I guess because a TV show or a lot of shows have this idea of this is the thing that we do. And there's a sort of a structure set up where it's each episode kind of does the thing that we do, be it solve a crime or have some romantic misunderstandings or some character drama. And then, every show has their bit that they do in every episode. But then it's what kind of makes the show interesting is what they build around it and what they kind of incorporate into it. So iZombie was quite interesting because it's a procedural crime show. In many ways it's quite similar to NCIS or whatever, but it's got all this other stuff kind of around it that makes it interesting.
Well, iZombie, I watched all of iZombie. By the end, even they barely cared about the cases of the week. Some of them were really quite token. And Lucifer occasionally heads in that direction, but I think it tries to keep the actual crime a bit more in focus than iZombie sometimes did. I mean, I guess they're probably quite similar shows. They're both based on comics from the DC Vertigo line, so I guess in that regard they've got a lot in common. Yeah, obviously they're both comics that were sort of angsty supernatural stories which have been converted into crime procedurals for TV. So there's that. But I think Lucifer, weirdly, I think Lucifer takes itself slightly more seriously, weirdly, than iZombie did. I think the melodrama stuff is slightly more melodramatic, which I think ultimately makes it slightly easier to fully engage with. iZombie sometimes feels like it's being written a bit through a sort of irony shield. But yes, obviously, as long-term listeners may remember, I did a whole bit where I talked about iZombie as I was watching it. So obviously, I am not in any way against the supernatural crime procedural genre. I'm just not sure what I'm going to watch to fill this space in my life now that I've finished all the available Lucifer and all of iZombie. I'll have to, research this. I'm sure that in some obscure channel there's a show where a werewolf solves crime.
I mean, it is a niche interest, but I'm pretty sure it'll be served by some aspect of entertainment.
Well, it's probably only about a year, maybe a year and a half max before Lucifer finishes. Surely someone's got to step up and take this crime supernatural creature baton before then. We'll have to see what happens. Alistair, what have you been doing in the last 2 weeks?
So I had some time off work, which during lockdown just meant I caught up on a lot of film and TV that I'd been meaning to watch for a while. And there's one film that's on Netflix I wanted to recommend to our listeners because I think they might find it interesting, and I really liked it. It's a film called Code 8, and it's a Canadian sci-fi film. And the premise is it's set sort of in an alternative present day when there are people with superpowers in America, and these people, the backstory is that they arrived in America at some point after the Second World War to help kind of rebuild the country and reinvigorate the economy after the Second World War using kind of superpowers just to make life and economic activity easier. But over time, the need for superheroes, or superpowered people, I should say, has decreased as kind of technology has replaced a lot of the roles that they did. And now superpowered people have to be documented to work, and there's a sort of big arm of the surveillance state set up to monitor them. The film follows an undocumented superpowered person who needs money for an operation to help his sick mum, and because he's undocumented he's struggling to get work and falls into a sort of an underground scene of superpowered people who do crimes, and there's a drug dealing plot line and a sort of various heists he gets involved in. And the plot isn't winning any awards for originality, although the kind of setting for the film is quite original in that it's about a nice guy who just wants to do nice things who gets mixed up in some bad crime with some bad people. But it's really entertaining. There's some very tense heist scenes along the way, and obviously the whole thing is a sort of big metaphor for immigration and kind of the role of undocumented immigrants in America, which is sort of an interesting political discourse to have in the background of what is a quite sort of entertaining, superpowered heist film.
I either had no idea this existed or I had just completely blotted it out for being an uninteresting film. This is what, from 2019?
Yeah, so 2019, as far as I'm aware, it's not based on any comic or graphic novel. I think it might be an expansion of a short film that the director made.
I see it's got both Arrow and Arrow's brother in it.
Yeah, so it's sort of a cast of recognisable people from superhero or geek media. He's good as, like, you know, a nice guy, sort of hero who just wants to do the right thing but is caught in difficult circumstances.
Yeah, obviously I watched 8 seasons of Arrow, and Stephen Amell, the Arrow man, he is incredibly good at the sort of tortured hero stuff. A lot of the time during Arrow, when some of the storylines get more silly, it becomes increasingly reliant on him to very much hold the whole thing together. His charisma is, I think, a big part of the reason that show ran for 8 years. But yeah, he is good.
Yeah, and he's kind of really what making this film works. Like I say, it's not winning any prizes, you know, for originality in the subgenre of nice guy gets involved with crime. But yeah, his kind of real sort of likable nice guy persona put in difficult circumstances kind of carries the film together. And yeah, there's some interesting and very tense heists. One of the things I think that makes it work is the superpowers in this. There's no one who's Magneto or Apocalypse level, kind of someone who could demolish cities or whatever using their mind. It's very much that, like, the superpowers are like super strength, levitation, being able to shoot electricity means you're quite good at soldering, or, you know, shorting out security systems during a robbery. So it's very much that, like, superpowers in this world make you good at either, you know, low to mid-level construction work or low to mid-level crime, which is, I guess, kind of helps for the metaphor of immigration and the way we treat migrants.
Well, yeah, and as you say, it's not that exciting when everyone just does general energy blasting stuff. So this is presumably better at the sort of superpowers crime crossover than that. What was it we watched? Project Power.
Yeah, this is much better than Project Power, partly because, aside from some interesting visual flair, Project Power had a very straight-up story. Yeah, just there was a cop on the edge. Yeah, there was a kind of rogue superhero out for revenge. Yeah, I just felt the Project Power never had some real, like, standout moments when Code 8 has some, you know, some good heists. And I do enjoy, like, a good heist. I'm a big fan of films like Heat. It's got quite a lot of good double crosses, like when the sort of the motley crew of criminals who are kind of like the hero, just nice people in a bad circumstance, and the kind of properly nasty criminals, you know, when they do a heist, there's always the bit like, okay, so when is someone going to turn on someone at an inopportune moment or something like that. So yeah, I think just the kind of background level of tension throughout is what makes it like an entertaining 2 hours.
Yeah, no, it sounds like a fun film. According to Wikipedia, it was funded on Indiegogo, so, you know, it's what the people want.
Yeah, I watched it as part of my ambition to watch more independent and non-English language or non-American science fiction. So this seemed to have come from a sort of up through an independent route, not made by a major studio, but it's probably got the effects budget of a medium-sized TV show, but now that effects are quite cheap, you know, it could be done using Adobe software. Like, the superpowers look really believable, and the drone surveillance state thing they set up to monitor the superheroes has a real sense of menace. So yeah, they've achieved a lot on a low budget, and I think it's the way they've mixed in these metaphors about immigration, the surveillance state. It means it's doing something, you know, exploring something more complex maybe than a lot of mainstream films get into.
I guess that Indiegogo must have funded a bit easier because it had Arrow in it.
Yeah, I don't know how they managed to get Arrow involved. Maybe the director had worked with the Arrow dude before. Like I say, he's a good lead. You know, adds a bit of star power to the film.
Yeah, it's nice when they can make these sort of genre superhero films that don't feel either like they have nothing to say other than they just wanted to make a superhero film because everyone's making them, or, you know, they're tied into the Marvel Cinematic Universe or something.
Yeah, I think they clearly had something they wanted to say with this film, which is one of the reasons why it really appealed to me. And it kind of reminded me a bit of like what Heroes kind of was in the early stages, in that it's very much about ordinary people having superpowers before, you know, it got lost in this whole kind of cosmic mythos of world destruction and sort of time travel and people with godlike abilities. It's more like that kind of base level of ordinary people trying to survive in the world with like superpowers and stuff. So one of the interesting things is that the main character's mum, her ability is she can freeze things, but she's got a brain tumor that's pressing on the bit of her brain that triggers her powers. So she just inadvertently freezes things, including parts of her own body, which obviously is unfortunate and dangerous. So it's it's not a cosmic level threat, but it leads to a sort of more ordinary life, quite poignant story.
Yeah, that's another good one. The depressing real life implications of superpower story.
So yeah, I'd recommend this if you're looking for something that's like definitely like a good geeky sci-fi film, but also at the same time is maybe just different after you've exhausted WandaVision and all of the Marvel Cinematic stuff on Disney+. I recommend Code 8.
Okay, now, here it is, what you've all been waiting for. Someone on the internet talking about WandaVision. They said it could never happen. So yes, if you didn't know, this is the new Disney Plus Marvel show, which ran for 9 episodes over, no, not 9 weeks, 8 weeks technically, and has just finished, about the Avengers, Wanda and Vision, moving to suburbia to have a nice quiet life after the events of Endgame. Except, of course, something's a bit weird here, because when we last saw Vision, he was extremely dead. So yes, something's not quite right here is very much the feeling that carries us through a lot of this show. And we slowly discover that all is not perfect in this strangely sitcom-like suburban world they live in. And yep, this is, of course, a homage to both old sitcoms and old Avengers comics. We have seen the whole thing. I imagine we're probably going to spoil it, on the assumption that by the time this comes out, it'll have been about 2 weeks since the last episode aired, and if you're overly concerned with WandaVision spoilers and are on the internet, you've probably either seen it or been spoiled by now. So, sorry. If you particularly want to avoid spoilers, then I'd suggest just running. So yeah, on that note, Alistair, what did you think of WandaVision?
So overall, I would say that I did enjoy watching it, and I liked how it kind of captured the zeitgeist, or at least the geeky zeitgeist. It came out every week and everyone was kind of discussing it on social media. And I did enjoy watching it and partaking in the kind of the weekly WandaVision discourse. But when I sat back and sort of think about the show as a work of art or a piece of television, I did feel that there were a lot of missed opportunities to make something that would have been better or more interesting. I really enjoyed the first few episodes. That was about characters living in this sort of artificial sitcom, obviously riffing on a lot of famous American sitcoms, but also weaving in this kind of mystery plot of, what's going on and kind of weaving in the superpowers into it. I really liked that. And then as time went by, obviously there was less of that. They brought in the characters outside it, and I did feel that the plot line of a group of FBI and military investigators inquiring into a sort of bizarre going on in a small town in America did strike me as this could just be an episode of The X-Files or A Town Called Eureka. This is getting away from what's interesting about the show. My kind of main criticism of the show really came together when at one point I thought, this reminds me of something that did this idea better. And I suddenly realised what I would have preferred is something like Life on Mars. Like the show Life on Mars, every episode is a self-contained 70s crime drama when they solve a case. But built into it is this more interesting stuff about Sam Tyler and why he's there and why he's gone back in time or what's happening to him. And I would have preferred something that stuck with each episode had been a self-contained sitcom episode, and then built on top of it, they had this, why are they in this strange bubble where these strange things are happening? Life on Mars does not cut to Sam Tyler's surgical team because that fundamentally isn't interesting. So I would have preferred something that stayed within the kind of concept of the show within the show and stuck to kind of doing sitcoms and then weaving in the sort of mystery plot around it rather than something that just stepped outside the bubble. So I felt there was a missed opportunity there, but I still liked it.
Yeah, I think WandaVision, as you could kind of see in the discourse around it as it went along, was very much trying to do, I don't know, if it's trying to do 2 things at once or it's just trying to do one thing with a slight side order of something else. Ultimately, it's clearly still a Marvel thing, which means it still had to be quite broad, quite accessible, ended a big fight, lots of exposition, a lot of wisecracking, often delivered by people sort of hunched over computers telling us what's happening in the superhero land. But also they did have this sort of soft David Lynch sitcom surreal pastiche angle, which for the first few weeks when they were really immersing themselves in that did get a bit of complaining from people who clearly wanted it to be a bit more Marvel. And then inevitably when, especially the 4th episode, and then sort of gently after that, it became more Marvel. The complaining then began from people who were upset that they hadn't, stayed the course and done 9 weeks of the sitcom with unsettling undertones thing. And as someone who likes both those things, I was more or less satisfied throughout, but I can't deny the weird changeover between the two was a bit juddering at times. Ultimately, I think it works mostly because they've kept their eye on the Wanda storyline, played by Elizabeth Olsen. And she's incredibly good in this and does more or less carry it as this traumatized person trying to cling to this fantasy world she's created for herself. Like in the final episode, which to be honest does feel a lot like it was a little compromised due to them having to stop filming and then start again due to COVID, under, I'm assuming, some kind of anti-coronavirus procedures. Like there's a lot of people conspicuously standing apart from each other in the final episode, especially during the sort of outdoor sequences. Like a couple of characters, especially what's her name, Darcy, played by Kat Dennings, vanishes during the final episode or so in a way that I assume translates to she wasn't able to come back after they broke for COVID. So I suspect the fact that some of the storylines kind of fizzled out might be a bit of a COVID thing, but it does kind of contribute to the slightly disjointed feeling between the beginning of the show and the end, and the sort of weird mishmash in the middle.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I guess it kind of helped the vision they were trying to execute. See what I did there?
Ew.
That they had sort of coronavirus driven into the middle of this, and I do feel for the people who managed to pull off something that does work despite all these restrictions. And I take your point, as a Marvel property, it works, and I was satisfied, with the kind of the Marvel story they were telling in that context, and like I can see why they needed to make something that appealed more to the fans. I suppose this kind of does lead to my overall broader criticism of the Marvel brand, which is that I guess it is I suppose aimed at a more mainstream appeal and more accessible appeal, and I would have preferred something like you say, soft David Lynch is a great way to put it, something that's a bit weirder, a bit trippier. I had hoped that with the move to TV they would feel free to kind of have a product like WandaVision they could push in a more challenging, slightly different direction based on the trailers, and this is purely based on trailers. It looks like Falcon and Winter Soldier will be a much more conventional Marvel property. I would have hoped that they could have stuck to something that I would have personally enjoyed more, in the knowledge that they've got shows coming down the pipeline that would be more fan favourites. They didn't do that, and I do feel that the concept of the show suffered a bit, but I suppose they didn't stop it from working as a show. I suppose it links back to us saying that it was a missed opportunity to do something more interesting.
I think the part that's probably slightly standing on it here is that the more Marvel-y superhero-y stuff, which you especially get to in the last episode, isn't their best Marvel-y stuff. Like a lot of the people zapping around flying, it's a bit generic. It's a bit, they fly in circles, they zap, they zip, they zop. It's not very exciting. I mean, the gimmick at the end when Wanda actually defeats the evil witch with a trick is a clever enough trick. Before that, there's quite a lot of just people generically flying around each other. I mean, thankfully, that happens about 10-15 minutes before the end, and they then cut back to the inevitable sad emotional scenes with Elizabeth Olsen and Paul Bettany, which are a lot better. I don't know. In terms of the Marvel brand, I think it depends how... We've talked before, ad nauseum, some might say, about the reason Marvel tends to emerge over their corporate competitors is that they are willing to allow a certain amount of flex and experimentation, while simultaneously also giving people what they expect from the Marvel brand. Nowhere is it more clear than in WandaVision, where they give them clearly a lot of experimental leeway, but still insist on coming back to, baseline Marvel content at the end. I don't know. I mean, it depends how much credit you're willing to give them for the flourishes they have, like the fact they made, a third of the series is sitcom homages, and the fact that they do buy in fairly heavily to a lot of the quirky pastiche stuff. Like, I greatly enjoyed it, even after the basic cover was blown. Like, we have episode 4, which is after the 3 episodes of solid sitcom, which is set entirely outside the possessed town, the Hex, they call it, and it's quicker, so I'll probably call it that as well, outside the Hex, and focuses in on the supporting characters, and does feel a bit like a high-budget episode of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. But even after that, there's still a certain amount of commitments to the sitcom angle, which I appreciate. I enjoyed their sort of, even if it doesn't take up a whole episode anymore, their sort of extended homages to, like, Malcolm in the Middle, and what I guess you call the Post Office modern sitcom interspersed with bits to camera. I like the fact that they kept it up still after that, even as things started to increasingly collapse. And the steady unravelling of it does work quite well. I don't know, it's weird to do a show which is sort of framed as a mystery, when the answer to the mystery is, with one exception, very obvious. Like, it's clear from about episode 3 at the latest that the answer to what's going on is, it's magic, it's vague, superpower, hand wavy, whatever. Wanda's done a weird thing, and the reason why is because she's sad, / because it's a metaphor for her sadness, and that's obviously the answer, so framing it as any kind of mystery is a bit strange. And they do have the sort of the Agatha Harkness reveal to give you something to cling on to as an actual explanation. And in fairness, there's an episode, episode 8, the penultimate one, where they go back and talk about exactly what was leading up to this, and it does work surprisingly well, considering, like I just said, it's basically telling you what you already know, but again, mostly due to Elizabeth Olsen and, to a lesser extent, but still Paul Bettany, acting it extremely well. They go through and explain the sort of emotional underpinnings of all this. And even though at this point we've long ago left the sitcom setting behind, it does, I think, work well to make it clear that this has some sort of basis. It isn't just, I don't know, a gimmick, I suppose. So yeah, I think there's a lot to like here, even if it is possible to come away a little bit underwhelmed by just how much it descended into generic Marvel action by the end.
Yeah, I think you make a good point that they should get credit for the amount of weirdness that they did put in, I suppose, rather than just only insisting that they did more. And it really did work when they did it, and I really liked how they weaved in so many references to kind of the Dick Van Dyke Show or Bewitched, especially in the early episodes. And yeah, I like how they really kind of nailed the iconography of sitcoms over the years. The Malcolm in the Middle bit bit was very good. I did like episode 7 that had the allusions to Modern Family, happy endings, so very much like post-Office, Arrested Development sitcoms. Yeah, I like the way they created this fictionalized American suburbia, which it's an interesting comment on the fact that so much of what we see of the depictions of American suburbia are these kind of fictionalized versions of it, and now we're looking at a fictionalized version within a fictionalized version. Yeah, there's something interesting there. I like the fact that they only stuck to suburban family sitcoms. They didn't deviate from that at all. So, like, yeah, for example, they didn't bring in Friends, which obviously is an important milestone in the history of American comedy, but it's not crucially a suburban family sitcom. It's an urban dating sitcom. It's very different. You know, like New Girl, which obviously we discussed before. It's a very different animal. That, you know, they stuck to the integrity of that. Part of me was a little disappointed, although it probably would have gone too far, that they didn't get a reference into The Simpsons there, because The Simpsons being the kind of the spoof of the suburban family sitcom. But I guess it would have just been probably, I don't know how they would have worked it in, like having an animated bit.
Yeah, I mean, I guess The Simpsons is now part of the Disney Fox mega empire, isn't it? God knows how they pulled that in, but if only.
It probably wouldn't have worked, but it would have just been too silly, like a bit when someone gets hit on the head and then there's an animated bit or whatever. But I did like their commitment to the bit that they were doing, like say throughout the first 2/3 of the show. I did enjoy that, and I did enjoy the kind of spot the references to little things like the Brady Bunch or Full House, which Elizabeth Olsen's older sisters had their TV debut on, which is a nice way to bring the whole thing full circle.
Yeah, and I thought Catherine Hahn was extremely good as the neighbour Agnes. Although, to be honest, I found her a bit less engaging once she was fully supervillainy towards the end. I thought she was written as a slightly generic floating villain character. But I did enjoy her quite a lot, overacting the shit out of it as this sort of nosy sitcom neighbour. I thought that was extremely fun. And obviously, yes, the Agatha All Along jingle is extremely catchy, and I watched it on YouTube a couple of times after the episode finished. Good job, Marvel.
Yeah, I thought she was great as well. Yeah, also kind of going back to what you said before, which is that quite early on, I was like, well, okay, like you say, the mystery is kind of obvious. It's clearly Wanda and her grief. You know, it's her kind of retreating from reality into this protective bubble, using her superpowers to achieve this. And one of the things I did like about the show is that when I twigged that quite early on, I was like, I really hope there's more to it than this, because I don't want to wait for 9 episodes for the bleedingly obvious to be told to me. But then, yeah, there was a twist that there was something more going on. She was being manipulated to some degree. That actually was, yeah, a bit when the show exceeded my expectations, which they should get full credit for.
Yeah, and for all that I talk about it, you know, going very full Marvel at the end, I think they deserve some credit for not giving in to the temptation to overload it with, I don't know, nodding winks to other Marvel stuff or heavy continuity. Like, I think there was a lot of internet speculation about whether they were going to reveal that Wanda was actually Magneto's daughter, which in the comics I think she is, or has been at some stage when it hasn't been retconned. Or bring in Reed Richards from the Fantastic Four, or bring in the Devil, Mephisto character from the comics. And all those things which would have just lurched out of nowhere just to announce themselves going, hi there, I'm a Marvel thing. If you're a big enough fan, you might know me. And everyone else just goes, huh? There was a good amount of nodding and winking to that stuff. Like, I think the Marvel supervillain, the Grim Reaper, his helmet is in the background of a scene at one point, even though he has no relevance to the plot. And of course, there's the most discussed bit of continuity when they bring in the guy who played Wanda's brother in the X-Men films, the sort of alternate version of Quicksilver, playing a version of Quicksilver in this sitcom, even though everyone is aware he's not the Marvel version of Quicksilver because he died in Age of Ultron. And everyone's a bit sort of, oh my god, is this the multiverse? So they bring in the X-Men films, and then at the end it's revealed he's just a random dude who was magicked by Agatha Harkness. He's just a man called Ralph Boner. There's been, I believe, some debate on the internet about whether this is funny. I think it is funny. It's not quite as funny as the Mandarin is actually an actor called Trevor reveal in Iron Man 3, but it is very much a similar sort of thing, and I did enjoy it.
Yeah, I really liked that, and I thought it was funny, and I thought that was a good way to resolve the bringing in Pedro, and yeah, and the fact that I think they totally made that work, and it would have deflated it had it linked to some larger multiverse continuity, and, you know, I think it worked the way it worked, and just having kind of Ralph Boner on the end was just... It was just like it's just a childish joke on the end of it, which I guess is we needed to lower the temperature on the kind of grand pretensions a bit, so that worked very well. And there's even a point when they mentioned he's a kick-ass brother, or I think the kids say that like he's a kick-ass uncle. And obviously both versions of Quicksilver were in Kick-Ass. I have no idea if that's an intentional nod to the film Kick-Ass. But I did like it. I did enjoy that. So those little nods and things in there. I mean, it links back to also the sitcom nods. They've put a lot in there for the people who want to kind of get into the show and kind of get nerdy with it, which I do like. And I do like the fact that it's not just a long string of Marvel Comics references that people who aren't as familiar with the comics won't get. And yeah, that also I like that they didn't just bring in Magneto or something at the end as a bit of a Deus Ex Machina. I did feel that the Agatha Harkness reveal, although good, it was a bit of sort of, well, someone who's not read the comics, I don't know who Agatha Harkness is. So it did feel a little bit of a like, you're supposed to get this if you do the assigned extra reading. It's a bit like, well, it's not a course. It's supposed to be kind of consistent as a show. But it did ultimately work as a plot device. So I'm willing to let them have this one.
The thing is, there's that much to it, really. I mean, she's another witch. That's pretty much explained, isn't it?
Yeah, which they do in episode 8.
Yeah, I mean, the one bit of Marvel continuity which I actually did think was a bit eye-rolly was at the end of, again, episode 8, when Agatha says, "You are the Scarlet Witch." Cut to credits. It's like, that's not a cliffhanger. That doesn't raise the stakes. He just said a word. Yes, it's a fan wank word, but nah, fuck off.
We all knew that.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, thankfully there was then a post-credits scene which did at least raise the stakes a little bit when they unveiled, what his name, Project Cataract, the White Vision. But yeah, the "You Are the Scarlet Witch" cliffhanger was one of the low points of the series for me. That was a genuine example of, here's a thing you recognise from the comics. Ooh, it's like, I don't care.
Yeah.
This doesn't work, sorry.
I mean, it's another example of where the Marvel brand is kind of taking over from trying to tell a functioning story.
Yes, but for the most part, I think they skipped around that and actually stuck within the bounds of their story and stuck to things that actually, affected Wanda rather than wanking off on their own. Yeah,
exactly. And it did build to a really emotional, tear-jerking conclusion when she had to say goodbye to Vision. I did feel, throughout the whole show, I was like, the big moment's got to be at the end, when she has to say goodbye to Vision. It's obviously coming, and I hope they pull it off well. And they did. With everything, I've always got a note of where there's ways it could have been slightly better, but that I felt it didn't connect to the kind of emotional climax, it didn't connect to the other sort of conflicts or plots going on, such as the plot line involving Agatha. I mean, this is just speculation, but maybe the writers couldn't find a way to link them all together, but it's something that works well in writing, and Marvel have done it many times in their films, that in the finale you bring together as many plot lines as possible to try and resolve them, so a kind of physical conflict should also resolve an emotional conflict. Perfect example of this is the original Thor. Thor's character growth is he must go from kind of, I'm a big tough guy and I solve things by twatting them with my hammer, to learning some humility. The big fight towards the climax of the film is when he fights the Colossus, and he learns to defeat the Colossus. Thor must, rather than twat it with his hammer, he must show some humility, sacrifice himself to save his friends. This shows both character growth and also defeating the big bad thing. In this, it would have been better if they did it together. The character growth is Wanda, letting go of her grief and letting go of her lost love. The sort of physical conflict is obviously her superpower fight with Agatha. If they resolve them both together, it would have been more powerful. I didn't write the show, obviously. I don't know how they would have done that. Maybe they tried various different ways and it just comes across as corny, or, it can't be paced properly, or it's just going to, fall into some other horrendous cliche. So they're like, we just resolve one then the other, we do them separately. It works. That is very possible, but there might have been a way to resolve it all together and build to a more kind of emotionally intense single climax. But that said, I'm asking for more from what the show did, which is not a way to say that what the show did wasn't good. I did like the final goodbye between Wanda and Vision, and it was very emotional.
Well, yeah, I don't know. I think ultimately they probably wanted that final scene between Wanda and Vision to be, just them in their house separate from the big fight. And I'd probably have given it a worse review if they'd had Wanda and Vision say goodbye to each other in the middle of a big zappy fight than doing the thing they did. So I'll take it, frankly.
Yeah, and also I think you're spot on when what makes it work is Elizabeth Olsen and Paul Bettany's performances, both of which is great, especially Elizabeth Olsen, who's in almost the majority of scenes in all the episodes. So it's a lot that she did. And she was, very, very good in this show, and a real talent. And it was good considering that Wanda and Vision, characters who didn't have a huge amount to do in the broader MCU, they were very much supporting parts in the big Avengers films. And, it's nice that they got their moment, especially with these two very talented actors, got a real space to act in, which was good.
Well, yeah, but I don't know how much this is part of the grand Marvel master plan, People have given them shit before for hiring, really good actors like Elizabeth Olsen and Paul Bettany, and basically hiring them for roles where they get a couple of scenes per film and otherwise just stand at the back. Did they actually have some brilliant master plan all the way back in Avengers 2, where they like, well, in 7 years' time, they'll get their TV show and then they'll see? Or do they just throw them out there and hope it works later? I don't know. I suspect it's probably some combination of the two. But in this case, their long-term master plan of hiring very good actors to play these sort of background roles has clearly paid off. I mean, the parts that didn't work for me in terms of the ending slightly trailing off was probably basically everything outside the Vision and Scarlet Witch Agatha storyline. I was alright with the way they resolved that. I thought the way she punished Agatha was nicely, considering what they're clearly doing with Wanda, it was both apt and also a little bit harsh and cruel. Considering they're clearly going, based on that final post-credit scene, with a little bit of moral ambiguity with Wanda going forwards. Has she actually fully learned her lesson about, overusing her slightly dubious magic? I think that's an interesting way to play it. I did, however, think that stuff like Jimmy Woo and Darcy going from having major supporting roles to doing basically nothing, the evil Trevor Hayward man trying to shoot some kids and disappearing, Monica Rambeau just sort of wandering off to space, and the other Vision who gains Vision's memories and then flies away. I don't know. The other Vision storyline is again part of the finale that bothered me slightly, in that having another Vision wandering around does seem to slightly cheapen the fact that the climactic scene of the series is the Vision dying. Like, if they want to bring it back in a later show, I don't know why they couldn't have just saved it for that later show. I don't know whether this is something else that was somehow superseded by COVID, or whether this is just franchise insurance, or if they just wanted to give Vision something to fight in the final episode. It could be any combination of those things. But yeah, a lot of the non-WandaVision stuff felt like it vanished a little bit.
Yeah, I completely agree with you that the supporting characters were quite poorly served by the ending. I mean, he wasn't a particularly complex character to start with, but the Tyler Hayward was very much just a generic bad army guy gone rogue. The person I think, who has the biggest case for feeling aggrieved is Monica Rambeau. She was a significant part of the show, including getting superpowers, and really does not have much impact on the final plot. She saves Wanda's kids at one point. Yeah, it did feel that did not mesh with the main ongoing storyline. She kind of was just like part of the background, along with Jimmy Woo and Darcy. So yeah, that was subpar.
Yeah, I don't know if I had huge expectations for Jimmy Woo and Darcy because, at the end of the day, it's clearly just an example of them giving us people we know to deliver and receive exposition instead of just using random shield drones. They could have just cast in a random dude, but for added fan service and to make it a bit more interesting, they found some recognisable characters. And, well done, guys. Fair enough. That was more fun. And I wasn't really expecting him to have major character growth or become Wanda's new sidekicks or anything. But I was sort of hoping they'd give them like a final kiss-off scene or something. But again, that may well be COVID.
Yeah, they were very much supporting parts. I do think Monica Rambeau's storyline was one that they were clearly setting up to go somewhere that didn't go somewhere. Unless the whole point was just to give her a plot line that sets up why she's a superhero for Captain Marvel 2. But they really should have done more with the character than just that.
I mean, I thought her intro was actually quite powerful, though. I think her role definitely trailed off as the series went on, but her opening stuff in like the first 10 minutes or so of episode 4 was actually pretty good.
Yeah.
Definitely endeared me to that character and that actress. So even if she didn't get an amazing resolution in this series, I look forward to seeing her future work.
Yeah, no, I thought her intro was great. Weaving in the blip from the Avengers and some good acting and stuff, and the personal drama and the character background was good. It's almost like the more she became a superhero, the less interesting and relevant to the plot she became.
It's definitely one of the more interesting Marvel products, but it's still a Marvel product. I mean, ever since we've been doing this podcast, especially at the end of the year review stuff, we always end up talking about what the next big TV show everyone's going to watch is going to be, what the next talky, water-coolery, chatty point thing is going to be, what's going to be the next Game of Thrones, or whatever was before Game of Thrones. Walking Dead, maybe? There was definitely a period where people were watching Walking Dead.
Breaking Bad, I suppose.
Yeah, I suppose. But yeah, and I sense occasionally some disappointment that the inevitable answer to what's the next big omnipresent TV show going to be is going to end up being Marvel stuff on Disney+, just like it is at the cinema. Because, it's not the most exciting outcome, but it does seem to be where we're going. Especially with their cleverly honed weekly release schedule that means these things become, the dominant cultural force for like a month or two.
Yeah, and I liked getting into the zeitgeist and checking various live blogs and feeds after each episode to try and get the best hot takes, and bits become memes like Agatha's wink becoming a meme that's just made it into like all aspects of life. So yeah, that was good, and on some level I'm really pleased that what's captured the Zeitgeist is this weird show when they kind of spoof sitcoms from like the 50s and 60s and mess around with kind of genre conventions and make nods to old bits of pop culture. And the fact that, I'm really pleased that managed to capture the Zeitgeist, and they pushed out something that was weird and interesting, especially as it looks like Falcon and Winter Soldier is going to be much more of a army dudes fight other like superpowered army dudes. I don't know if this is true. I believe it is true, though. Like, isn't the villains in Winter Soldier going to be the Flag Burners? An anarchist group called the Flag Burners. So this could be McBain level unsubtle.
I know one of the villains is going to be the main villain from Civil War, Zemo, but I don't know who else is in it.
Yeah, well, maybe he's the guy behind the Flag Burners.
Maybe.
So, I mean, we'll save reviewing Falcon and Winter Soldier till after it's come out. But I did like that they did this weird show first, and I did like it was weird and interesting, and I did like that people seem to respond positively to that.
Yeah, I think the Marvel popularization maximization algorithm will hopefully glean something from the fact that, they put out this slightly odd, not just punching and quipping show, and it seems to massively resonate, and therefore, maybe they'll take more risks in the future. Maybe they'll make a show where they go all the way with the weirdness. Although, for the record, if you want a Marvel show which goes all the way with the weirdness, watch Legion, guys. Just like we've been telling you for years. Watch Legion. It's really good. It embraces the weirdness much more fully than this show does. Okay, and next up this fortnight, we are talking about Tribes of Europa, a German dystopian sci-fi show which we watched on Netflix. It's set in the world of 2074. After a mysterious blackout in the late 2020s, the world is now a technology-free, empty space full of individual tribes living aggressively isolated lives and occasionally coming to blows. And in this fractured, separate dystopian world, 3 siblings from the Aborigines tribe have to go on a series of little quests after their tribe is rather antisocially wiped out by the neighbouring crows. And a series of bad things happen. Alistair, what did you think of this show?
So it's an interesting concept for a show that I did enjoy, and they clearly had like a vision for like a sort of future Europe where people aren't divided by sort of language, culture, or national identity. They're divided almost by sort of outlook on life. Like the crows are a sort of into sort of violence and blood sports, and the strongest wins. There's one tribe that's basically an army. There's the Aborigines are kind of the sort of forest-dwelling hippies. I mean, they're not particularly sophisticated identities, but it is interesting to have this identity that's not based on culture or language. It's doing an interesting thing with language that people seem to speak combinations of English and German, again, which is to show this is kind of post-language, post-cultural divisions, post-national identity divisions, which is an interesting idea. It kind of reminds me a lot of, from my childhood, the video game and later role-playing game Alpha Centauri, which kind of did a similar thing, but on Alpha Centauri about humanity being divided by ideology and outlook rather than culture and language. So yeah, which is something I did enjoy. On some level, I felt that the whole was a bit less than the sum of its parts, in that there was a lot of good plot threads and interesting characters that I liked. I never felt it got to sort of moments of nail-biting tension or on your edge of your seat excitement. But yeah, it was for the setting and the characters. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, I thought it was another one of those shows which is too competent for me to really smash, but also a bit too bland for me to particularly enthuse about. In some ways, it felt weirdly dated. It felt like someone had only just seen both The Hunger Games and Walking Dead and had decided to try and smoosh them together, with maybe a slight hint of Game of Thrones, which again isn't the newest and most original angle. As you say, there's some interesting ideas in there about a future of Europe, or a future dystopian setup, but I didn't feel like the way they dramatised it was massively interesting. It's kind of fine, and I was broadly with it in terms of following the plot. I think my interest kind of sapped a bit over the second half of the season as it became pretty clear that they didn't really have it didn't really feel like they had any bold new story twists coming. The characters were largely kind of charmless. Like, I'm sure I've mentioned it before on this podcast because it's, pretty standard thing, sort of dull protagonist syndrome, where you have one character who's kind of the slightly bland, put upon vaguely every person who the bad stuff happens to, and then all the supporting cast around them get to be interesting. And this show had a weird sort of free-fork structure where every thread had its own dull protagonist, and the other characters weren't that interesting either. They had a character called Moses in one of the threads who did at least seem like he was having fun and did at least seem like he might have a bit more to him than just being a put-upon man in a dystopia. Again, this might be the 9 years of Walking Dead that has battered down my soul talking to me, but my interest levels in slightly sad people plodding through dystopian hellscapes are quite low at this stage, so I found it quite hard going at times. I must admit, when the evil tribe who wear vaguely bondage-inflected gear and a huge stripe of black eye makeup, and they do a lot of licking stuff and hang out in this sort of darkened goth club, I was a bit sort of, Jesus. Once again, I assume it's 10 years ago. Yeah, I don't know. It's not actively bad, and if you're aggressively into your sort of dystopian YA, then yeah, it's fine. It's well enough made. The characters could be a bit more interesting, but it does its thing fine enough. I just found it slightly bland and dated feeling, and it never really pulled out any memorable character angles or particularly good twists. There was one okay twist in the finale with there's a storyline where one of the three siblings, Liv, spends her entire time hanging out with this sort of group of militants. The Crimson, is it? Crimsons?
Yeah, the Crimsons, they're the one, they're basically an army.
Yeah, and that was, to be honest, not the most interesting storyline, because it kind of threatened to become interesting for a bit when she sort of looked like she might be forming a bond with a Crow prisoner, but then that didn't go anywhere, and then it was not interesting after that. There was a good twist in that in the very, very end, but I don't know. The gaps between interesting parts were far too long.
Yeah, you're right that it has a problem of three bland, nice protagonists is kind of the issue. For example, like Liv's plotline, I found them all like interesting and watchable, but Liv's plotline was one that was some bits disappointing because she was with the Crimsons and you always got this sense of what she wants is not what the Crimsons want. She's going to betray them and then she's going to be like on the run from the Crows and the Crimsons, and that's going to really raise the stakes. And it just never quite got there whenever it looked like, we're just dropping spoilers all over the place at this point. So there's your spoiler warning. But whenever she like looks like she's betraying the Crimsons and striking out on her own, actually no, it's part of a plan which she was working with the Crimsons all along, and it never kind of gets that next level of tension. And it's always like, is Liv betraying the people who helped her? No, she's working with them because she's a nice person and they're all good people. Yeah, and it's similar to the other two main characters, Kano and Elia. Elia and Moses was probably my favourite part of the show, them on their truck. Moses is played by Oliver Marsuni, who you probably remember from was Ulrich in Dark, that we loved on this podcast, and also played Hitler in the film adaptation of Look Who's Back. So probably at this point quite a big name German actor.
Yeah, no, he was great in this show. Well, it was a decent part. He was pretty good at it. The moustache was a bit weird, but he was very charismatic.
Yeah, doing obviously a very different part to Ulrich in Dark. It's interesting that he speaks English with a slight sort of Australian lilt, which is not uncommon actually amongst German people I've met, possibly because there's quite a few Australian English teachers in Germany. But yeah, it was unusual that after sitting through 3 seasons of Dark, I hadn't heard him speak English at any point, obviously, so it was interesting.
Yeah, no, he was definitely the highlight. Again, if only because he seemed to have a few more shades to him than just earnestness. So yeah, and then the third storyline was what's his name, Keanu, gets taken by the Crows and ends up going on a sort of journey through the dark hierarchy where he goes from being a prisoner to being a slave to potentially towards the end becoming one of them. Sure. Theoretically, it's the most interesting journey, I suppose, but I didn't really find the actor and character that endearing, and as I say, I don't know whether this says more about me than the show. There did come a point where I found it the sort of bondage goth club cyberpunk licking things aesthetic of the Crows a bit much to take seriously.
Yeah, I think as you sort of said before, the villains wear bondage gear and hang out in goth clubs is a cliche that borders on the harmful stereotypes, to be honest. It's dangerously close to a tinge of cultural identity prejudice. Cultural identity prejudice is not necessarily the same thing as prejudice against people of a certain race or sexuality. I mean, that's a big kettle of fish maybe we don't want to open right now, but it is at best a lazy stereotype. It is at worst actively harmful to people in that subculture to have them portrayed as what are essentially Saturday morning cartoon villains. Maybe over time we'll find out more about the Crows and there'll be some aspect to them that makes them more interesting or complex than being basically Saturday morning cartoon villains. But at this point they are quite stereotypical.
His storyline, I guess, also technically had a twist in the final episode, although unfortunately it was a twist I saw coming about 2 episodes beforehand in terms of who he has to fight in his induction battle. That was pretty telegraphed, so I didn't get much out of that either.
Yeah, that was obvious. And also, I guess what they're kind of going with the Keanu character is that he's kind of going to eventually kind of almost become like Stockholm Syndrome indoctrinated into his enemies and, becoming a member of the group that killed his family and his tribe. So, which is an interesting character journey from, how someone can kind of get seduced Stockholm Syndromed into becoming evil or joining the thing that they despise. So there's an interesting angle there, but they kind of, again, missed the opportunity to make it interesting. I mean, when he has to kill someone familiar to him right at the end, the person he's killing is very much like, you have to do this to survive. It was more interesting if he actually suddenly just the character made a decision that he was going to become bloodthirsty and do whatever it takes rather than get permission to kill the person that he kills. It's better if as a character, if he basically decided, like, well, if I'm doing this crow thing, I've got to do it no matter what, which is something that would have more tension in it than what they went with. So again, missed opportunities.
Yep, pretty much. Yeah, he just didn't really feel like he was struggling with that much. He felt like he was just being bounced from pillar to post in a slightly, oh, I guess something else is happening to me now type way. It's like, oh, woe is me. Something else bad has happened to me. The sad Charlie Brown of the show, anyway.
The thing about the Keanu character is that he kind of does a good job of looking traumatized and kind of like he's a zombie walking through his own life because he's experienced so much trauma. I can't decide if that's basically the guy's really good at acting that or he's just a bad actor and looks kind of bland and out of it all the time. It's either very good performance as someone who's mentally checked out of their own life and is on sort of survival mode, or it's just some bland, unexpressive acting.
Yeah, I don't know either. Could go either way, but unfortunately, between that mode of acting and the fact that I just can't engage with the crows as a culture or tribe because it's just too silly. That storyline did not end up working.
No.
So yeah.
Yeah.
I hope this won't end up being worst TV show of the year because that seems slightly harsh, but it's definitely the first item to go further on the shortlist.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say... I'd be surprised if this is the worst show I've seen this year, because there were things I liked about it. Maybe I was just more into the setting and setup. I did feel that this first series of 76 episodes seemed really to be manoeuvring the characters into position to tell a bigger story. It finishes with Liv has joined up with another tribe, the Amazons. Keanu has become a crow, and Elia has discovered the secret base of another tribe, the Atlanteans, who appear to be the only ones with functioning technology. So these are all kind of interesting beginnings of stories. So in some ways, it almost is like that's kind of the point you could have got to at the end of a sort of feature-length pilot episode.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I as I say, it lost me a bit in the second half because it just felt like they sort of got into these ruts and weren't going anywhere. Realistically, the points they reached at the end of the season was probably the point they should have, at worst, reached about halfway through the season. And then we could have had, a second half that actually went somewhere. Whereas instead, I'm just not sure if I could be bothered to watch the second season. If they make one, I don't know if this has been renewed.
I don't know. I mean, I even thought that, is this one of those things that they're dropping it in two halves? Like Lupin, that was releasing on Netflix, they've only released the kind of the first half of the first series. I thought, oh, is this a first half of first series job? Because that's very much the kind of, the way they get to the end is kind of the beginning of a story. But we'll see.
Yeah, I don't know. It's honestly hard to say. There's not really enough coverage of this on the internet to work out what they're doing in that regard. It doesn't sound like they've already been renewed for season 2. I
mean, there's enough in the world to make me watch a second series. There's plenty of shows that have sort of slightly bland beginnings go on to be more interesting.
As I've said about other shows, if I later hear via cultural osmosis or you that this has become amazing in later seasons, I may well go back and catch up. But as of now, not sure.
That's all we have time for. If you have enjoyed this episode of Moderate Fantasy Violence, then please subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. You can also visit our website, moderatefantasyviolence.com, where you can find other episodes of the podcast, bonus audio clips, and written pieces by Nick and myself.
And if you want even more, you can also follow us on social media at MFV Podcast on Twitter or Moderate Fantasy Violence on Facebook, where you can hear all about films that came out in 2001 from Alistair. And if you want to follow still more accounts, you can follow me at NickMB on Twitter or Nick Bryan Writes on Facebook, and you can hear more about my writing endeavours at nickbryan.com.
If you want more from me, then follow me on Twitter, where I'm at Alistair J.R. Ball, or visit my website, breadtrainblog.com. In our next episode, we'll be discussing Pacific Rim, The Black, and Zack Snyder's Justice League, aka The Snyder Cut. Long anticipated, long in length, long in discourse, probably as well. Find out what we think about that in 2 weeks' time. Bye.
Bye.
Sorry, I forgot to say bye.
It's okay. It's probably too busy thinking about the Snyder Cut.